get here today? Don't answer. Just hold on to that thought. So that's actually the question I asked my students on the first day of a class I teach at Duke called Chinatowns. And it's a class that talks about a particular kind of spatial formation called Chinatowns that sometimes form from discriminatory zoning laws or ghettoization, sometimes for mutual protection, sometimes for commercial opportunity. Chinatowns seem to share an architectural vernacular, not a coincidence, but kind of developed and usually marked by the symbolic gate, as if they were a threshold, that if you walked in, you would be in a foreign place. Even though Chinatowns are often found within cities around the world and in North America, but they become symbolic of something foreign and something outside, something strange. Which means that Chinatowns often function as a space of escape. They were the places where you could find brothels or gambling dens or opium dens. They were places, they had the thrill of danger, the possibility of being kidnapped into white slavery. They were literally the 19th century version of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. They were a source of inspiration. The new bohemians in 19th century San Francisco saw it as a way to escape what they saw as stifling bourgeois morality in Victorian times. And they saw inspiration and excitement in this place called Chinatowns. But dehumanizing images have often deadly consequences. In the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, where fires broke out everywhere in San Francisco, city officials actually held back local firefighters from entering the space to save Chinatown because they thought it was an expeditious way to burn it down, this place that was a source of contagion. This was a pattern that was repeated in many places, in Wyoming, in LA, in Honolulu. Dehumanizing stereotypes and images of strangeness often have deadly consequences. Almost a year ago today, 8 people were killed in 3 Atlanta massage parlors. 6 of them were Asian women, by a 21-year-old shooter who said that he was trying to cure himself of Asian sex addiction. So in my course on Chinatowns, I really want to explore a deeper story, which is actually why I'm here today, to talk about what is a community? What makes a community? Especially, what makes a community that is not built on family or blood or national ties, but built on strangers? What is the affiliation that we might build together because we live together and we work together and we love together and maybe sometimes we die together? So out of the 8 who were killed in the Atlanta shootings, 7 of them were quickly identified, but the 8th, Feng Daoyou, was not claimed for almost 2 weeks. We only knew her by name, Feng Daoyou, and knew her age, 44, and had a single picture of her, a selfie. But the Chinese Atlantic Association decided to come together and throw her a funeral. So that brings me to the question about communities of strangers. Why should we care for strangers? Certainly when they are alive, but if we don't do a good job of caring for them when they're alive, how can we care for them when they are dead? Why does it matter that we bury the bones of strangers? This Vietnamese-Chinese Atlanta Association member was asked to give the eulogy. She says, "May you rest in peace. Your life did matter." So the question I'd like to ask is, why bury the bones of strangers? But get back to something a little bit more light. The question I asked my students, how'd you get here today? I mentioned that you shouldn't answer, but I also tell them not to answer, certainly not in language. I figured if you're a college student at Duke, you're probably pretty good with language. You're probably pretty good at telling a story about yourself, either verbally or in written form. So I say, try drawing it in 90 seconds. And by the way, if you want to try it, I left index cards on the way out. And people draw all sorts of things. Hey, 90 seconds, come on, give her a break. So, but one of the points I want to get to is, how did you get here today is a big question. By plane, train, or automobile, or C2 shuttle bus? But every immigrant story is a story of arrival. And since I don't assume my students were born in the classroom that I'm teaching the class in, I assume they got there somehow, right? And the story of travel is a story of arrival and not origin points. It doesn't matter where you come from. It matters what happens when you get there. And in the case of travel, the cost of travel is not only just its cost. A middle class kind of a coach ticket from China is probably $2,000, maybe a little more expensive now. Expensive, but not prohibitively so. If you're middle class and you can save, or you have funds, or you have a scholarship, or you have a grant. But for someone like Feng Daoyou, a 44-year-old who left home at 14 to support her family, she probably could have spent upwards to $80,000 in accrued costs, in costs to pay for her circuitous travel, her many paths, for documentation, for snakeheads, for money owed to her employers. So the cost of travel and the means of conveyance is a big part of the story of immigrant arrival, similar to the 17th century immigrants who left because of increasingly strict boundary laws by the Qing Empire and pushed out, but also drawn in by the promises on paper, by contracts. So paper promises drew them to a foreign land in order to find opportunity, but often their bones got left behind here. How did you get here today? This was the Zoom year, so you might have just rolled out of bed. How did you get here today is also a story of cultural identity. A lot of my students will draw parents or immigrant arrival for another generation, right? Or studying hard and getting through high school, so they ended up here. So it brings up the question of you. How do you define identity? It's a quick, easy way for me to think about and to teach and communicate the various postulates of identity that I rehearse with them. First, are you someone? Is it essential and primordial? Or do you have an identity? And you do have an identity, which means it's a possession. Is it your sole possession? And if it's a possession, can you lose it? And if it's a possession, can you swap out? Can you cut your queue so you never have to go back to the Qing Empire? Or can you put on a new set of clothes? Or is it something hard-earned and easily lost, like a set of muscles? I wouldn't know. Or is it like a childhood tongue that you no longer speak well? The second postulate identity might be who I think I am and who you think I am might be different, and it's a constant source of negotiation over time. So I may stand here and tell you I'm a young white guy. You may dispute that. That's okay. Sometimes, for early Chinese, they might think they're American and they're challenged. So Kim Ark, who you see here, was a feisty young chef who was born in San Francisco and thought of himself as American. He was filial and went home to visit his parents, who had gone home to Canton, but he found himself not living well there. So he decided to go back to the US and continue his life in San Francisco as a cook. Meanwhile, the Chinese exclusion law of 1882 had passed, and he could no longer return. He was kept on the boundary, on the border, and not allowed to enter the country. So he sued, like a good American. He took his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Kim Ark versus the US became the major precedent for testing the premise of the 14th Amendment, the Birthright Amendment. Also, 100 years later after the Chinese Exclusion Act, Vincent Chin, who was beaten to death with a baseball bat, a Chinese-American man on the eve of his wedding, because out-of-work auto workers thought that he was a Japanese person. All Asians look alike is something that a lot of us have heard, but in moments of like the Chinese Exclusion Act or moments of violence, such as Vincent Chin's life and death, it becomes Asian American identity is no longer about who you think you are and where you're from, but rather what happens when it gets there and other people treat you as such. Asian American identity is built out of arrival and not origin. Also, who are you if your story is invisible, is illegible? So this is a famous photo at Promontory, Utah, where the last stake of the Transcontinental Railroad was symbolically drilled in by Leland Stanford, founder of Stanford University. Where are the Chinese laborers he hired? Maybe he didn't want to talk about them because in 1867, they struck. It was a major labor strike that forced him into conceding and paying them more. 100 years later, in Utah, the same place, the Transcontinental Railroad was commemorated. And this time, Chinamen, and I use that term, Chinamen were included, but they looked stereotypical and faceless and passive, not the labor striker Chinamen. Ironically, more recently, the Stanford Railroad Project funded the archival excavation of the spectral traces of the Chinese laborers. And here you see, perhaps, one Chinese man, his ghostly trace, in the photograph. How did you get here today is also about the ground of geopolitics. The ground may shift under you. As you can see, my student here, his family was born in the Mexican Empire in the 1800s, but then they became labeled as outsiders, foreigners, in what is current-day Texas. Sometimes how did you get here today is also about what you have to conceal. Because it was so dangerous in parts of the US to be Chinese and to be strange and to be labeled foreign, they literally went subterranean. In 1925 in Oklahoma City, in a particular excavation, 3 stories down of Chinatown were discovered, where Chinese men obviously lived and played and gambled and worshiped. Or sometimes, how'd you get here today is about a here that is way up there. This is Ah Sing with the founding members of the Sierra Nevada Club, which then, of course, was the founding of the National Parks and Service. And kind of like Ginger Rogers, who could do everything that everybody else could do, but in 3-inch heels and backwards, Ah Sing went up in this expedition carrying all the kitchen utensils and the food. But he is credited with the founding because of his delicious breakfast that all the members recorded. And now in Yosemite, there is Sing Peak. How did you get here today? For a middle-class person like myself, who first arrived at 16, I was brought here because my mother, much earlier a widower, remarried a Chinese American who was able to give me a visa, a pathway towards a green card. But even I suffer from diaspora blues. The Nigerian poet Ijeoma Ubewinos, who says, "Now here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, not enough for both." 如果我现在开始用中文跟你们说话了，谁听得懂呢？听得懂的可不可以举手？听不懂的不要举手。If you didn't understand, I said don't raise your hand, so that worked. But did you tune me out when I spoke a different language? And for those of you who did understand, are you willing to interpret? So I asked my students to swap their index cards and try to decipher each other's stories. Who are you if you can't tell a story of who you are? Language is a talisman for survival, but sometimes language is an impediment for assimilation. What if everybody just tunes you out because you can't tell a story of who you are? Paper suns, guidebooks, cheat sheets, the effaced, slight etchings of poems on walls. Angel Island was about to be torn down when a park ranger noticed graffiti on the walls. Community activists like Kim Ark and Judy Young were brought in. They said, this isn't graffiti. These are poems written by the first detainees in the 1910s and repeatedly etched and repeatedly copied over until they were etched deep by subsequent detainees who wanted to preserve these stories. So people who did hear the stories of who they were. How did you get here today? And sometimes that today turns into an eternity. 200,000 Chinese fought on the Allied front in World War I. They left their bones there. They left their stories there. This is in Mount Hope Cemetery, a bit outside of Boston, where I spent many days in Chinatown. Maybe somebody who thought he was in transit, but now left behind. The first railroad workers in the 1860s had only one contract stipulation, that their bones be sent home so that they could be buried in their ancestral village. Chinese culture reveres the dead, believes in funerary practices and memorializing and steles. But what do you do with anonymous dead when you can't put them in proper relation to humans? How do you talk about them when the small society of family can't help take care of the bones? How do the large society of humans come together to take care of the bones of strangers? Donghua Hospital in Hong Kong has burned incense to these anonymous bones that didn't quite make it home according to contract from the US back home, and they still remain, and incense is burned to them daily. The contract did kind of get fulfilled. In 1870, a newspaper mentioned that 20,000 pounds of bones were sent home in a big shipping container containing the remains of over 1,200 railroad workers. But I'm sure they didn't intend originally to have their bones sent home by being melded with strangers. But sometimes it happens. Sometimes bones get melded with strangers. Sometimes kin is not built of family and blood, but of shared work and faith and trust and affiliation and future promises. Stories of arrival rather than stories of origin. Tai, a San Francisco merchant, accused of being strange in the San Francisco Examiner, but because he wanted to be buried here, not back home. Or Feng Daoyou, who we then later discovered who she was. Her family devastated to find out that she had died, but even they were kind of vague about her story since she had left home at age 14 to support her family, traveling, crisscrossing China, and then eventually making it to the US. They were deeply moved that there was a funeral thrown for her, but they demurred when they were offered the bones to be sent home to them. They said, "We're sorry, but as an unmarried woman, her bones cannot be returned to our ancestral village." So she remains here, buried in Norcross, Georgia. But sometimes stories have a happier ending. How did you get here today? This is the celebration at the 150th commemoration of the Transcontinental Railroad. This photo, taken by the great Chinese-American photographer, Corky Lee, is of all the living descendants of the original railroad workers. So I hope we can think about, through an example of a community like Chinatowns, that we can make strangers kin because all kin are strangers. We take care of our living and our dead. An author that I like very much said when he was a little kid, asked his parents, "You call everybody 朋友, friend. What does that mean?" His parents answered, 可以托孤. Friends are those with whom you can trust your young, should they be orphaned. In the absence of blood, in the absence of ancestry and home, friends and allies and community are people with whom you can trust your lives and your children's lives and entrust that they will bear your bones. So let's make kin out of strangers. Let's make scarcity turn into plenitude. So don't be a stranger. Thank you.